Everybody, welcome to the morning market briefing. It's Monday, November 28th, 2022. Hope you're doing well out there. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. All that good stuff. Dow futures down 60 basis points, S&P down 80, NASDAQ down 80, oil down, gold down, silver down. A lot of red, nothing, maybe not all that surprising. Even Bitcoin down, my favorite joke. The great hedge down more than everything else. Let's open up with a pretty big story, I feel like, coming out of China with these protests. A lot of protests erupting over the COVID restrictions. Pretty rare to see citizens of China just take to the streets, essentially. Ben, is this a turning point in any way, or is it just a wild moment?
I think my guess is it's going to be put down, just like a lot of them have. For background, the reason that this is happening is these COVID restrictions are incredibly onerous. They've been put back on the menu. And it's all been catalyzed by this fire in the province of Xinjiang at an apartment complex. There were COVID restrictions, and they're alleged to have delayed firefighting efforts and essentially been blamed for the death of 10 people there. So now the ball is in Xi Jinping's court. What is he going to do? Is he going to bend to the will of the people and remove some more of these restrictions? My guess is that he's probably going to be passive aggressive about it. Basically say, look, I'm saving lives here. You guys just don't get it. And basically use the sympathy card.
Fire might kill you, but COVID definitely will.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'll tell you what will really kill you. Protesting in China.
They're protesting without masks, so that's probably why. Not
well, I mean,
no, I get you.
I mean, what do you think has a higher body count by the end of the week? The official standing of the 5,000 deaths that have happened from COVID in China, according to them, or the number of people killed in these protests by the Chinese government?
And that's the thing. I think that the Chinese hawks, or people who look at China in that way, fear a much more militant or an authoritarian response from Xi. And I would say, if he's more in the Mao line of thinking, that's probably not a bad conclusion to draw. So it is taking down oil, it's taking down stocks. It's going to have a hit to iPhone production. They're talking about another 6 million unit shortfall on the iPhone Pro. Basically, right now at this Foxconn facility in Changshu, their violent protests against these COVID restrictions, it holds as many as 200,000 workers, but a lot of people stopped working there in October because they weren't getting food. They were basically having to be fed at the facility because they weren't able to leave, and so a bunch of them just quit. And then the new employees have rebelled against pay and the quarantine practices. So I think it really has heightened the risks of doing business in China for multinationals. And I think it also has some impact on overall demand within China, as well as supply chains throughout the world.
Yeah, it's a bigger impact. I mean, that's the frustrating thing about this is, I kind of liken it in some ways to oil, where there's a certain degree to which, if you're really heavily invested in the oil space, whether that's through, an Exxon or whether it's, trading futures or whatever, at a certain point, you're just kind of at the mercy of these governing bodies that you don't really have any control on over. The same is also true for anything that's got ties to China. And the challenge therein lies in the fact that so much production runs through China. And it's, at the end of the day, I think situations like this magnify problems that have always been there and make it quite a volatile situation, and it can have a very broad impact on markets. And we're seeing that to an extent today. I mean, today's maybe in the grand scheme of things a blip, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how this plays out. It's a weird one. The FTC is filing a lawsuit against Microsoft to try to prevent their purchase of Activision. It was a $69 billion purchase that they announced back in January. Microsoft's trying to kind of massage this thing and say, hey, we can make sure certain games are available on other platforms. We don't have to limit them. But what's y'all's read on if this will go through?
I mean, I think that we're just in an environment right now where the Biden administration is not big on mergers and acquisitions, right? big on unions, they're big on regulations, but they're not big on bigger companies getting bigger, particularly bigger tech companies getting bigger. And I think that's a real headwind for Microsoft. I think, what Microsoft's really doing here is paying a big premium to do what PlayStation and Sony already do, which is if they have an independent game that does very well on PlayStation, they'll basically buy the small company and bring those guys in-house and say, hey, you can develop games only for PlayStation. What Microsoft is doing is basically looking at the biggest names and trying to bring those internal, and kind of try and freeze out PlayStation on the other end. So I don't know. I don't think it goes through. I think that's just the stance that we're getting from the government right now is that, we saw it with Kansas City Southern and the Canadian Pacific deal. We had to jump through a million hoops to get that done. We've seen other things fall apart.
And we still don't know if that will ultimately close. It's in a blind voting trust right now.
Yeah, and we've been talking about that since the initial deal, like
March 2021.
Yeah. So I just think it's a bad regulatory environment for trying to make big deals. I mean, Ben, you probably know more about it than I would, but that's sort of the stance I've got on it.
Yeah, I mean, you see it with Meta. I mean, they were just trying to buy an app. They were trying to buy a virtual reality fitness app called Supernatural. I don't know if you've heard of Supernatural. I hadn't. But the FTC was going to block that. We obviously saw NVIDIA trying to buy ARM. We saw Lockheed trying to buy Aerojet Rocketdyne. There are actually even calls to unwind the 2010 merger between Ticketmaster and Live Nation because Ticketmaster is charging too much for Taylor Swift concert tickets. I mean, too much is kind of a relative term. I mean, what is
this was a deal that was done 12 years ago?
And I mean, it's supply and demand too. I mean,
so I guess the question is, what's next for these companies? I mean, if you can't make a strategic acquisition, if you can't buy back stock, because remember the 1% buyback tax is going into effect next year, which to be fair has not altered any plans, it seems to me, in terms of companies slowing buybacks. If anything, buybacks.
I think that's just a headline grab.
But if the administration is intent to stop these uses of cash, what is the use of cash? Because companies are still going to try to generate profits, and I think they're probably just going to let that cash just build up on the balance sheet.
Well, I think that's part of, in a backhanded way, I think that's a lot of what this administration has tried to accomplish. I mean, we've seen them single out the oil and gas industry and say, hey, they're making too much money. We need to stamp down on this, not just here in the US, but even in Europe. I think a lot of officials, I don't want to point fingers at any one person in particular, but I think a lot of people would say, well, Microsoft, if you're generating too much cash, it's because you're selling things for too much. And you need to be leaner because we're not going to let you use that cash really for anything. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious. I don't know if you have thoughts on what Microsoft does from here.
I think that they just need to back away from this deal. I think it's a lost cause. They have so much money. Maybe they just continue to go a little bit, but as soon as it becomes a distraction, it's just not money losing. Because I think right now, if it's $1 million or $3 million or $5 million a month, it doesn't really move the needle for Microsoft. But if it becomes a distraction and starts to move resources away from one thing, especially if it becomes a distraction for upper management, I think they'll just move away from the deal. I think they could look at another deal, but frankly, at this point, why look at another deal?
What kind of know what's going to happen?
Exactly. So I think they might just end up buying back some stock. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think that ultimately this deal will not go through.
I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, I'm not a big video game guy, so I don't really understand that world. It's interesting to me, though, the purview through which we are now analyzing any kind of merger or acquisition. When you think of trying to prevent monopolistic activity, you think about it through the lens of, I do anyway, let's make sure essential services and essential items are not so controlled by one party that there is no alternative and the prices go through the roof. I think it's actually much easier to think about it in the pharmaceutical or the drug pricing space. And now we're basically saying, well, we don't want these video game playing nerds to have to buy, an Xbox and not be able to play this game on PlayStation. It's like we've really gotten pretty low on the rung in terms of how much this actually impacts humans on a day-to-day level.
And I think what ends up happening is you start to, if you go too far down this, and I think that some regulation of legitimate monopolies is definitely warranted and necessary.
Yeah.
But if you go too far the other direction, you really actually stifle creativity in the other way and actually only further the interests of these large entrenched companies. I mean, what's Supernatural going to do? Supernatural is probably going to be, I mean, if they're not able to get on the Facebook platform or the Meta platform, they're probably just going to die a death. What's the next app that's created going to do if they don't have a legitimate way to exit? You saw that with Adobe having to buy Figma for $20 billion. That was an example of Figma creating something better and Adobe being forced to make this acquisition because they needed to, and giving Figma an exit. And I think and Figma had a profit incentive to actually go off and create something that was better. But if you're not able to get that exit, you lose the incentive to create something that's better. And I think that just stifles innovation long term.
I mean, you could even use Disney as an interesting, like, acquisitions are a great option for people who are shareholders of a smaller company. Like Activision shareholders would benefit from this, right? And it's almost like, Disney brought on Star Wars and Marvel, right? And they're like, well, we're going to corner this market because if you want to watch Marvel movies or Star Wars, like, you got to come to our Disney Plus app. Well, guess what? People didn't. And now they're losing a ton of money. And, it wasn't great for the people who owned Marvel and Star Wars, Lucasfilm stock. Yeah, they made a ton of money, but now Disney's got to figure out how to manage this. That doesn't mean
it's not always a win.
Yeah, just because you bought something and you overpaid for it means that you're crushing it. And, it could be a potential pitfall for Microsoft that could actually hurt their monopolistic power. But you got to let market forces play out, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. We had Black Friday a couple days ago, big sales day, obviously, especially on the retail side. Overall, Ben, I mean, you got a lot of data points here. Overall, I felt like the numbers were relatively favorable. Certainly some areas where maybe it wasn't quite to expectation, but not a terrible day, at least from the data we've seen so far. What are your views?
Yeah, it seemed like traffic was a little bit better than expected. It seems like traffic was very much broad-based throughout the day, which I kind of put down to, I think a lot more companies are giving Fridays off these days, the Black Friday off. And I think that you're seeing that in terms of persistent sales throughout the day. You're seeing sales were a point or two higher than expected. Traffic was significantly higher than expected. I think this bodes well for holiday sales, especially when you consider the early Thanksgiving this year. You have a little bit more time to do the Christmas shopping, which just ends up in more money spent. And with expectations relatively low on the retail holiday season, I think that that's going to be good. You had some data points from MasterCard saying apparel was up 19%, restaurants up 21%, electronics up 4%. The 4% on the electronics may seem low, but bear in mind that's comping over last year where we had massive sales of PCs and iPhones and all these products for working from home. And I don't think you're seeing as much as that this year. I think you're seeing a lot of big screen TVs get sold. So I think you're seeing a different mix. Shopify reported sales up 17%. So I think that there is some definitely some growth out there. I think consumers are intent to spend. They want to get a deal, but they're probably going to spend the money regardless.
Did you guys do any Black Friday shopping?
I did not.
No. I was in here for a while, not super long. Ben was in all day. I don't know.
Just grinding, No, not really my scene, the Black Friday thing. I went to Waffle House for breakfast with some friends on Friday morning, and there's like no one out.
Yeah.
It was the Waffle House on Dallas Highway, kind of near Target and all that. I kind of did a loop around, and it was not real crowded. I was relatively surprised that the numbers came in pretty good.
Yeah, I went to dinner with a couple buddies in Buckhead right by Lennox, and there's like 5 people at the restaurant, which I was surprised as well. So
But they were all at the Battery.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Battery bin.
I went to so the market closed at 1. So I was able to get down there, and my goal was to go to this Irish pub called Mac McGee's to watch the England US game, and there was no room, not even standing room.
Wow.
So
everybody out to support our lads,
Yeah.
Big game tomorrow.
Up the boys.
Maybe we could get Mo in for a game preview.
yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be good. That'd be good. All right, we'll wrap it up there. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 8:30, and we're here all week, and we'll talk to you guys soon.